This time a bit more conservative. So, I'm really excited, obviously, for the next panel. And I would like to introduce the speakers and invite them on stage. So the next panel is State Violence and Mental Health. And I would like to introduce Wilda L, founder of Med Freedom Incorporated from the US. China Mills from Heading Justice London, UK. And the panel will be moderated by Julian Schwarz, psychiatrist from here, from Germany. So please. While you're accommodating yourself, I would just like to shortly introduce Julian Schwarz. He's based in Berlin and working as a social psychiatrist and researcher at Brandenburg Medical School. He practices policy research, digital tools, and alternatives to mainstream psychiatry. He has been involved in several research projects where people with and without lived experience of psychiatric treatment conduct collaborative research. Julian also advocates for digital sharing of clinical notes, open notes, with service users in psychiatric and psychotherapeutic settings. I'm really, really excited to hear more about your thoughts today, and I will leave the stage now and leave it to you, Julian.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elena, for inviting. I would just introduce the keynote, State Violence and Mental Health, and I'm honored to host this keynote by Wilda L and China Mills. And just a remark at the beginning that as a white, able-bodied cisgender man who has never experienced state violence or any other major form of discrimination, I consider myself as an expert, not as an expert, but as a psychiatrist who wants to learn from our speakers. So far the conference has been on the suffering and injustice associated with the structures of mental health care, especially towards marginalized groups within the care system and possible alternative approaches beyond psychiatry. Tonight we want to leave this focus a little bit. We want to concentrate more on the oppression that people labeled as mad from institutions beyond the medical care system. Specifically, we'll look at how political and cultural systems, the pharmaceutical industry, the media, large corporations, and the welfare state exert implicit and explicit violence that contributes to each individual's mental suffering. In her keynote, Wilda L. will argue that the roots of injustice and violence associated with the mental health system can be found outside of it. Using the example of American society, she will show how the systematic oppression of those labeled as mad is linked to negative cultural assumptions and stigmatization about them that permeate all spheres and areas of social life. China Mills talks about the weaponization of mental health, state violence, accountability, and justice. This is about making visible the systematic violence and discrimination that state institutions such as courts, local authorities, job centers, health insurance companies, and large corporations perpetrate against mad, disabled people, all in their own way. Both keynotes are about developing and applying theoretical concepts and practical strategies for action to overcome state violence. It's about making visible, collecting evidence and testimonies of state violence in order to finally be able to hold responsible actors and policymakers accountable. So let me introduce the first speaker, Wilda L. Thanks for having traveled all the way from the US. Wilda is a mad activist and psychiatric survivor. She founded Med Freedom Incorporated, an advocacy organization based in the US, whose mission is to secure power and influence to end discrimination and oppression based on mental state. She just recently published a chapter within the Routledge Handbook of Med Studies entitled Rewriting the Master Narrative, a Prerequisite for Mad Liberation. So, yeah, Wilda, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you to the Disruption Network Lab for taking up this issue of justice and mental health. It's very heartening to even hear those words in the same sentence. I also want to thank in particular Elena for curating this conference, for Nada for making my travel arrangements, which were extremely seamless and uneventful, and Jasna Russo, who I understand brought me to the attention of the Disruption Network Lab, and also Julian for your moderation. So the impetus for my remarks today comes from an experience I had recently. A few weeks ago, I attended a conference hosted by an organization of court-appointed lawyers. These are people who represent people in legal proceedings when psychiatrists want to forcibly medicate them or forcibly hospitalize them. And during one of the conference workshops, the presenter, a lawyer, told us that his wife, who he described as a burned-out social worker, thinks that, and I'm quoting here, the mentally ill should be shot on sight. I was stunned and shocked by this comment. I actually thought most Americans just mostly pitied people labeled with mental illness. I did not realize they wanted us dead. And my shock turned to horror when I heard a few people laugh. After the workshop, I found the lawyer who made the comment, and I told him that the comment made me feel violated and at risk in a way that I'd never felt before as a person with a psychiatric history. And he insisted there was nothing inappropriate about the comment. I asked him, if your wife had told you that she thought Black people should be shot on sight, would you have shared that with us? And I had no idea what his answer would be. I was just trying to figure out if this is a person who had no filter and said whatever popped into his head. But he immediately said no. First, he reassured me that his wife didn't feel that way about Black people, and he told me if she did feel that way, he would never say that publicly. And so I asked him why. And I don't remember his exact words, but he said something to the effect that there's social disgrace and condemnation if you say you think Black people should be shot on sight. So implicit in his explanation was his belief that there is no social disgrace or reproach incurred if you say the mentally ill should be shot on sight. And he's clearly right. When he shared the comment in the workshop, it was not met with any condemnation or social disapproval. Other than a few laughs, no one said or did anything. And as far as I know, I was the only one who was upset by the comment. So today, I want to talk about why in America you can get away with saying the mentally ill should be shot on sight when you can't get away with saying Black people should be shot on sight, especially since in the case of Black people, that has not always been true. I'm in my mid-60s, and I'm old enough to remember a time when there was no social opprobrium or condemnation attached to killing Black people. In fact, I would argue that it's only recently, with the launch of the Black Lives Matter movement, that Black lives and Black bodies have come to be valued in mainstream America, such that there is universal understanding that social disgrace and condemnation would most definitely attach if you said you thought that Black people should be killed on sight. I think pondering this question of why you can get away in America with fantasizing publicly about shooting the mentally ill on sight will help us understand something about state violence and injustice in the American mental health system and what we might do to address it. When I use the term state violence, I'm referring to the use of legitimate governmental authority to cause unnecessary harm and suffering to individuals and groups. It includes threats of violence and actual violence, and I'm not limiting it to physical violence, but including like psychic violence and emotional violence. In the United States, the legal system sanctions state violence in the mental health system. The laws permit mental health workers, including psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, orderlies, social workers, to use force against psychiatrized people if they are perceived to be a danger to themselves or to others. State violence against psychiatrized people includes restraint, seclusion, forced drugging, and forced hospitalization. And people are often seriously injured in the process. During the time that I served as executive director of an advocacy organization for psychiatric survivors, I routinely received photos documenting bumps and bruises and other injuries suffered during forced drugging and forced hospitalization. Last year, in the state I live in, a state called Vermont, a patient who had been hospitalized involuntarily in a psychiatric hospital refused to go back to an isolation room after taking a shower. And while staff was escorting her back, she reportedly fell and immediately started screaming in pain. Staff then put the woman in a restraint chair and involuntarily injected her with medication. About 50 minutes later, the woman told the staff that, and I'm quoting her, "My fucking hip feels broken." And one of the staff members told investigators that she expected it was just a strain due to the woman's old age. Another staff member compared the woman to the boy that cried wolf. And after the woman's groans grew louder, staff called a doctor who showed up 2 hours later. And 5.5 hours after this supposed fall, the woman was taken to the emergency department where her x-ray showed a broken hip. And I share this example with you because I want to be clear that the force we're talking about is not benign, but that can result in serious physical and emotional injury. And psychiatrized people are uniquely singled out for this type of violence. A person may be perceived to be a danger to himself or others. However, if they do not have a mental illness, U.S. law does not allow force to be used against them. In the U.S., there is clearly something about your status as a psychiatrized person, as opposed to this danger, that makes us subject to state violence. I personally experienced a threat of state violence several years ago when a police officer dressed in plain clothes showed up at my office when I was working at an American university. I was on the telephone at the time, engaged in my work, and he told me he had come to take me into custody because he had received a report from my psychiatrist that I was suicidal. When I told him I was going to finish my telephone call, he unbuttoned his sports coat and directed my attention to the gun on his belt. And I hope you can recognize the irony of a police officer threatening homicide to a person he believes is suicidal. This is what passes as care in the American mental health system, which is of course not care at all, but control. And in the US, when members of marginalized groups are singled out and subjected to state violence, that violence is often privatized and reproduced in the community against members of those same marginalized groups. We see this clearly with members of the Black community in the case of police brutality. So for example, in 2012, in a well-known case, before the launch of the Black Lives Matter movement, a man by the name of George Zimmerman, a private citizen, killed Trayvon Martin, a Black teenager who Zimmerman described as suspicious, and a jury found the man not guilty. So in addition to being subjected to violence in the mental health system, psychiatrized Americans are also killed by police at alarming rates. One statistic that floats around the US is that people with so-called untreated mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed by police. Now, while I have some quarrels with the methodology and assumptions used to arrive at that statistic, there is certainly empirical evidence that people in emotional distress are disproportionately killed by the police in the United States. For example, I live in a small state of about 630,000 people. In the last 10 to 15 years or so, at least 10 people in mental distress have been killed by police. And those have really been the only law enforcement killings in the state. And it's also true of psychiatrized Americans that we have significantly higher risk of becoming victims of non-state violence, this privatized violence, compared to the general public. So I think state violence towards members of marginalized groups gives private individuals a license to reproduce that violence in the community and are fantasized about reproducing such violence against marginalized communities. But I don't mean to suggest that this is the entire explanation for why people can get away with fantasizing about shooting the mentally ill on sight. I think most of the explanation lies in American cultural politics. And by cultural politics, I mean the way culture, including people's beliefs, opinions, and perspectives and attitudes, as well as the media and the arts, shape society and political opinion and give rise to certain social, political, and economic realities. For psychiatrized Americans, these realities include the highest rates of unemployment, the highest rates of incarceration, dying 20 to 25 years prematurely, a workforce where 58% of Americans say they do not want to work with people with mental illnesses, where 70% of employers say they are reluctant to hire someone who is currently taking psychotropic medications, in a separate and inherently unequal healthcare system for mental health that relies on coercion and whose treatment options are limited to inpatient beds and medications. In the state I live in, it is unlawful for people with, quote, severe psychiatric disabilities to marry. And severe mental illnesses in the US are defined as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major clinical depression. And until last year, in the state I live in, there was a law on the books that created a presumption that people with psychiatric disabilities were unable to consent to sex, such that a person could be found guilty of rape for having sex with a person with a psychiatric disability. And that law was recently changed following advocacy by Mad Freedom, the organization I founded in 2020. So the injustice we see in the mental health system is a symptom of the problem and not the problem itself. The injustice in the mental health system is the result of attitudes, beliefs, opinions, and perceptions about mental illnesses that most Americans hold. In other words, it's the culture, meaning public opinion, arts, and the media, that imbues politics, meaning the government and the law, the legal system, with perspectives about mental illness that give rise to an unjust mental health system, as well as state violence and privatized violence against psychiatrized people. The media, the arts, and the language Americans use to talk about mental illness have deeply embedded in the American psyche negative attitudes about psychiatrized people. Studies consistently show that both American entertainment and news media provide overwhelmingly dramatic and distorted images of mental illness that emphasize dangerousness, criminality, and unpredictability. In the media, people with mental illnesses don't hold jobs. They don't run businesses. They don't raise families. They don't fall in love. They don't coach football, and they don't go to church or temple. In America's newspaper of record, the New York Times, it said it's not unusual to see headlines such as "Mr. Trump is nuts" or "Who's the real American psycho?" And our political leaders, including former President Barack Obama and former President Trump, frequently use words such as crazy or psycho to disparage their adversaries, without a murmur of critique from the media and without any protest from advocacy groups. I can remember about 20 years ago doing the New York Times crossword puzzle, and the clue was something like mentally ill, and the solution was nuts. I wrote a letter of complaint to the editor of the puzzle, Will Schwarz, and I received a typewritten note in reply defending the clue and the answer. Because of the prevalence and normalization of these behaviors, the core, albeit unconscious attitude held by most Americans about psychiatrized Americans is that we are not people. We are the mentally ill. This designation, the mentally ill, robs us of all personhood and humanity and reduces us to no more than an illness. So when the burned out social worker says the mentally ill should be shot on sight, she is clearly focused on illness and not our humanity. And the lawyer can get away with telling us what his wife says because most Americans unconsciously see us only as an illness and not as human. And because of the current state of cultural politics, there is no way we can make significant changes in the mental health system, say nothing of abolishing it, without first taking on cultural politics. And of course, this is what the Black Lives Matter movement has done. It's also what the gay rights movement has done. It's how political change happens in America. And of course, this is easier said than done. And I think the reason it has not been done is that because psychiatrized Americans are so busy trying to escape the category of mentally ill that no one is refining the category of the mentally ill and making a full-throated declaration of the right to be both mentally ill and human. Our plight has been orphaned both by the shame of being labeled mentally ill and the urgency to escape the label. And this makes us really unique among marginalized groups. Other marginalized groups of which I'm a member, by choice or assignment at birth, fight to redefine the labels we're given, and in most cases, reclaim those words. I see a real uneasiness among psychiatrized Americans with embracing and these words like mentally ill or mad or crazy. And in many cases, I see an outright rejection with people defiantly proclaiming, "I'm not mad, I'm not crazy, I'm not mentally ill." Something I've learned from being Black and queer is that the names by which we are called never apply to us. But in answering them, we find our voice and our power. For me, these terms mad, mentally ill, and crazy are not a reflection of my mental state. I embrace these terms because I want it known that regardless of my mental state, I'm still a human being. And I insist on the same rights, the same protections as those who would oppress me based on my mental state. When I embrace these terms, I'm saying I love myself. I'm saying I'm proud of who I am. Whether mad or not, crazy or not, mentally ill or not, I love myself, I'm proud of who I am, and I am entitled to the same rights and the same protections as any other person. I identify as mad as the same way I identify as Black or queer. Those terms are not who I am, they are what I believe. They are political identities, not biological or social identities. And finally, I embrace the term mad as a way of making visible the oppression of psychiatrized people and as a way of entering a movement to change the world. And I don't think we can ever influence cultural politics unless we embrace these terms, unless we are not shamed by them, and unless we answer to these terms, and until we make that full-throated declaration of the right to be both mentally ill and human.
Yeah, thank you, Wilda, for sharing these experiences. It has left me speechless somehow, and I don't want to say many words now. We will discuss later, and I would like to present China Wills now. China, thanks for having traveled all the way from from London. And yeah, China lead the Death by Welfare projects at Healing Justice London. And China's also a senior lecturer at City University of London, where she researches and teaches global mental health with a focus on state and corporate production of harm, distress and death by suicide. And China is also author of the book Decolonizing Global Mental Health, the Psychiatrization of the Majority World, also published by Routledge. And yeah, China, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I just want to hear Wilda talk more. So, yeah, that was amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you, Elena, and thank you, Nada, and the whole team for organising such a wonderful event. And like Wilda said, just having mental health and madness and justice named together as the name of the event, I think is so important and very unusual. So I just wanted to maybe start by saying that I love the name of this panel because madness is absolutely foundational to state violence. So the state gets its power from being able to perpetuate violence that it frames as being legitimate. And central to that legitimacy are constructions of madness, right? Of irrationality, of unsound mind, and the way that they cross over always and link together with ideas of civilization, colonial constructions. So it's the state that gets to frame certain forms of violence as legitimate, as rational, as necessary, and often as not even counting as violence at all. And I think that gives a clue to me and to us maybe as to why we won't, in my opinion, find justice within a state-sanctioned justice system, and definitely not within, say, the current criminal justice system. Angela Davis teaches us a lot about the perils of looking for representation in structures that reinforce racial capitalism, white supremacy, ableism, and sanism. So let me tell you a story. So I grew up alongside family members who saw things and heard things that other people didn't, and who psychiatrists diagnosed as having schizophrenia. And so psychiatrization is etched into my life and all of our lives in ways that are felt differently at different times. In the maternity notes for my child is written a family history of schizophrenia, marked out while they're still in the womb. So when I was a teenager, I was prescribed antidepressants after one appointment with a local doctor that lasted for 7 minutes. This story of too easy access, though, is not everyone's story. It's both problematic, and it's also a symptom of the privileged differential treatment that I moved through life with as a white person. All of this was an early lesson for me that systems that claim to care are sometimes negligent and violent. And how we imagine and enact care is limited by paternalist, carceral, and capitalist ways of being and imagining. It took me a really long time to understand how care then in our family was complicit and shaped by those violent systems. So what is called mental health has been a part of my life for a really long time. But it was in 2009 that I came across what is called global mental health when I was working on my PhD in India. And I was working with organisations that are founded and led by people who identify as psychosocially disabled or as psychiatrised people or mad identified people, including the brilliant Bapu Trust in Pune, which was founded by Bhargavi Davar. At first, I was really carried along by the promises of global mental health. It talks about closing the treatment gap, about creating access to mental health care for all over the world. But an uneasy feeling in my stomach started to grow. Because what did global mental health count as mental health or as mental health care? Who got to decide the agenda? And where were the folks with lived experience in all of this? It was at the same time, while in India, that I learned more about the hundreds of thousands of farmers dying by suicide in India. So suicide is deeply personal and political, and it touches all of us in different ways. It's important to emphasize scale and numbers when it's brutal social conditions that are leading to suicides. But sometimes I find myself saying, like, deaths, because there have been so many deaths, as if each of those deaths isn't also somebody's life, a person who experienced joy and sadness, a human being whose non-negotiable dignity was systematically and brutally contested. And this is a tension I try and hold in my work, which looks for patterns of harms that lead to many people's deaths, but also remembering and holding each person who has died and those who have very nearly died with love and with honour. So I can't promise that I'm going to make this conversation safe, because suicide in relation to state and corporate violence is totally harrowing. But I will take care in talking, and I hope that you will take care in listening, and I won't share any details of people's methods of suicide. So it's farmers in India themselves and their families, as well as research, that shows that farmer suicides in India are largely the result of massive debt induced by the aggressive promotion of agribusiness and, for example, the effect of genetically modified seeds on market prices. So what does global mental health have to say about farmer suicides in India? Global mental health advocates, while acknowledging the harm caused by unrestrained economic reforms, have put forward interventions such as improving treatment for depression and increasing access to antidepressants among farmers. Similarly, the Indian government in certain states has sent out teams of psychiatrists to talk to farmers. The assumption at work here is that mental disorder is the main contributor to suicide, and global mental health uses the term mental disorder. It's not something that I would use. And that suicides can be reduced through psychiatric interventions. And of course, the pharmaceutical industry, like agribusiness, is another massive market with financial incentives to sell drugs. So talking of profits, Syngenta is a Swiss biotechnology and agribusiness company which is owned by the bigger parent company ChemChina. It's been widely slated for aggressive agribusiness practices in India, including restrictive seed patenting, so i.e. selling seeds that produce plants that themselves don't then produce productive seeds, so you can't engage in traditional seed-saving practices. You have to go and buy the seeds again from a company, okay? And that has been seen as massively contributing to the conditions that lead to farmer suicides. But after a bit of digging, guess who sponsors World Suicide Prevention Day and also the World Health Organization's suicide prevention policies? Syngenta. And so discovering this made me realize that the assumption that suicide is always about mental health is more than just not paying attention to root causes. It's the active use of mental health, or mental disorder as they call it, to obscure attention to root causes. So this is where I learned that mental health can be used as a weapon to deny government and corporate accountability in creating conditions which produce distress and make lives unlivable. So while I was doing my PhD in India between 2009 and 2012, austerity was ramping up in the UK and punitive changes to the welfare system, known as welfare reform, were underway. This was a series of intersecting policies that are rooted in conditionality, So including the introduction of the work capability assessment, a point-based assessment which determines people's fitness to work and their eligibility for benefits for welfare, which is outsourced to and carried out by private companies. And also the use of sanctions, so punishing people who don't meet specific and often incredibly bureaucratic and, to be honest, absurd conditions by withdrawing part of or all of their welfare payments. So from about 2010, many disabled people's organisations formed in resistance to cuts to public services and to these welfare reforms. There are so many of these groups, but groups such as Disabled People Against Cuts, DPAC, Black Activists Rising Against Cuts, BARAC, and the Mental Health Resistance Network. Resistance harnessed the creative genius and rage of disabled people, including mad identifying folks. And we're going to see some of that later when we get to hear Dolly Sen share some of her work. And so from around 2012, the local press in the UK also started reporting on inquests and accounts from families of how their relatives had died after being left destitute, after starving to death, or after taking their own lives after encounters with the welfare system. So some of these people have written suicide notes that name the government as responsible for their death. Now, I'm going to show you just a few, I'm not showing you the suicide notes, I'm going to show you a few names of these people who have died from just a tiny few months in 2013. So I don't mention any methods of death or of suicide, but just to warn you that that's what's going to happen next. Okay. Oh, at least I think it is. Yeah. So, as you can see, even in a tiny bit of time, August and September 2013, we see at least 4 people's deaths. And that's just what we know about, right? And this is always, we never know the full extent of these people's deaths. So Mark Wood died in August 2013, who starved to death after his benefits were stopped. On August 23rd, David Barr took his own life, just a month after being found fit for work. In September, Michael O'Sullivan took his own life. And then we started to see that the coroner for Michael O'Sullivan actually named this assessment process that disabled people have to undergo as being a trigger for Michael's suicide, and wrote a prevention of future deaths report to the government saying that this had to be addressed, otherwise it would affect more people. And then we also saw the death of Tim Salter, again a coroner naming these conditions as leading to Tim's death. So the deaths and people with lived experience, have been, and especially disabled people, including people with lived experience of the mental health system or distress, have been so central in showing how welfare violence kills people and how these deaths form part of a wider toll of austerity measures. So, for example, and there's so many examples of resistance that I could have shown you here, but we saw the 10,000 cuts and counting in 2013, where disabled people laid out white flowers across Parliament Square in London, each one representing the death of a disabled person who had died shortly after undergoing the government's work capability assessments. We see art activism from artists and activists like Vince Laws, who himself lives on disability benefits, who made these shrouds with the names of the different people that have died due to different welfare reforms. And this is just a slightly zoomed in version which says benefits stopped, starved to death, dead people don't claim. And so the Deaths by Welfare project comes in this context, okay? And I currently lead the project, and it's based at Healing Justice London, which I'll tell you about in a second. In the project, we investigate the links between welfare reform and people's deaths, including suicides. We centre and learn from the expertise and brilliance of the folks most impacted by welfare state violence, and that is especially including disabled people. The project is co-designed with disabled people to understand how the welfare system systematically dehumanises disabled people claiming or trying to claim welfare, and ultimately kills people, including making life so awful that people kill themselves. So we talk about welfare state violence because the welfare system has been brutal for a really long time, like before welfare reform too, and because it allows us to see how violence from the welfare state is connected to other forms of violence, so in immigration, in healthcare, in education, and in mental health. And that's important for connecting across struggles. So part of our work is to trace the often slow and really bureaucratic violence that characterises welfare state violence, where there's often like this lag between the introduction of a policy and then the kinds of harms and certainly deaths that start to happen. And that obscures cause and effect. It makes it really hard to see. And I think that is used to weaponise, by the government, that time is used to weaponise time is weaponised then in order to stop us from seeing cause and effect and government accountability. So this kind of slow violence can also fragment structural analysis, and yet it's those most harmed that often bring the structural analysis of their experience. People who claim welfare, disabled people, farmers in India, MAD identified folks, and many bereaved families of loved ones killed by the state and corporations have played a central part in insisting that harms and deaths have documentable origins. In the policies and practices of state and structural violence, be that the welfare state, agribusiness, the immigration system, the mental health system, and more. More than an unfortunate sort of side effect of policy, fear and harm and death are directly and indirectly designed into these policies. As my fierce colleague and co-founder of Healing Justice London, Fazana Khan, says, they are a feature, not a bug. Yet suicides linked to the welfare system are almost entirely missing from UK suicide prevention policies. And the UK frames itself as a model for mental health around the world, despite being found by the United Nations to have committed grave and systematic violations of disabled people during austerity, and since austerity. So, to conclude. So seeing this body count of welfare reform and knowing most names are missing is just heartbreaking. Part of the story, though, is also of relentless, pervasive, cumulative devastation is also unrelenting resistance. Sometimes that's tacit, sometimes it's written in bed, sometimes it's screamed out on the streets. It's a story of disabled people joining with bereaved families and bearing witness to welfare reform's deadly impact. So the Deaths by Welfare project is part of Healing Justice London, which began as a collaboration of women of colour living in London and nurtures cultures towards futures free from intimate, interpersonal and structural violence. The project is part of a wider strategy of Rehearsing Freedoms, which is a 2-year programme of community-based healing and structural interventions inspired by the visionary abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore's ideas that we need to rehearse the social order coming into being in order to collectively envision and practice futures free from oppression. Moving against the organised abandonment of the state, we want to envision and rehearse what life-affirming institutions and practices can look like, and creating a capacity to reimagine welfare is a core part of the work. But I just want to say that this analysis of diagnosing root causes, structural analysis, needs real care. Because we live in societies that delegitimise and pathologise psychological pain, people's experiences of alternate realities like hearing voices and of neurodiversity. So for a few years I visited folks that were detained in 2 of the UK's immigration removal centres and met with people that were incarcerated there. And people would tell me that they were being driven mad, that they were hearing voices because of the system. They knew that the system was doing that to them. So what's mental health justice there? Incarcerated folks barely got any mental health support in the detention centre, and most support was psychiatric drugs. But it isn't about making mental health support better in immigration detention. It's about getting rid of immigration detention and the system that props it up completely and creating something human in its place. It's also about abolishing systems that produce experiences that can be distressing, like hearing voices, while refusing to pathologize and devalue the experience of hearing voices and alternate realities, recognizing that many folks have those experiences and value them and find meaning in them. Another way of saying this, perhaps, is that we mustn't equate addressing root causes of harm with the idea of cure so dominant in the medical and psychiatric industrial complex. So yes, we need to name, abolish and transform systems that drive people mad, produce distress, but we mustn't centre ableism and sanism, the systematic oppression of mad ways of knowing when we do that. This means mobilising against deaths produced through state violence, while also against the assumption that disabled people, including mad people's lives, are not worth living. And so mental health is about abolition, about justice and imagining life-affirming infrastructures and ways of being. And suicide prevention is about abolition, about transforming hostile conditions and state violence where the priorities and principles are set by those who are harmed and have lived experience and analysis of intersecting structural oppressions. Ultimately, resistance to state violence is about creating more livable worlds. I'll stop. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, China, and thank you, Wilda and China, for your inspiring presentations. I think this is such an important work you do, and thank you also for the testimonies of state violence you've been collecting and the lived experience you shared. As I already said before, that it left me speechless, and I would like to know more about your work and thoughts, and therefore I have some questions for you. I'd like to also invite the audience, but maybe we can first talk a little bit about, in your keynotes, it became clear that political and cultural systems, the media and corporations contribute to each individual diagnosis. And I also heard a critique of size-centered ways of thinking and the exaggerated focus on psychiatric violence, which ignores many other sources, as we heard before, of oppression of people who consider themselves as mad. And I still want to understand better what's the role of the mental health system in enabling this diet violence. This may be a question for both of you.
You're asking what the role is of the mental health system in perpetuating violence?
Yeah.
Well, the mental health system is a perpetrator of violence, and they get that authority from the state, right? So under the law, they're just allowed to use, they become agents of state violence. I think what's interesting in the United States is that it seems that a lot of the practice of medicine is based on kind of legal requirements. So the law dictates that psychiatrists and other mental health workers are required to report any of their patients who have a mental health diagnosis if they think they might pose a threat to somebody, right? And so in that sense, they perpetrate violence against their clients, their patients. There's also, the perpetration of violence just through lack of informed consent. Even when you think you're voluntarily consenting to taking medication, you never, get told the kind of all the side effects or the disadvantages or given a choice about it. And I think that's also a form of violence within the mental health system. But I think the real point I was trying to make in my remarks was that, the problem doesn't begin in the mental health system. The problem is just the societal system and the way it conceives of mental illness and people who've been labeled with mental illness.
Thank you, Wilda. And it reminds me of, thinking about what Audre Lorde says in relation to single issues. And mental health isn't a single issue. It's connected to that, to all of those systems. So the mental health system it's not just connected to. All of these systems have grown up tightly threaded and intertwined with each other. And therefore, the ways that they intersect, I think, give each other power. And that's that bigger system, I suppose, that they're all playing out. So I agree with Wilda, I don't think always focusing on mental health and the mental health system, in a way doing that is a distraction from those tight intersections with the other systems of state violence. And we know that because in the UK we see increasing use of models developed by the police and by police officers used in so-called mental health care. We see the use of police a lot more as part of community mental health, so-called care. So that's intertwined tightly with the police, tightly with the welfare system, immigration system. So, yeah, they intersect. And I think also that the idea of madness and irrationality is just so tightly bound up with the very kind of foundations of the state and the way that they get to legitimize what counts as violence or not.
Maybe related to this complexity of this state violence is the question of how to get evidence about it. So, from as far as I understood, it's not a complex issue to collect evidence on single cases of state violence in the context of mental ill health, but it seems to be more difficult to me, however, to get a complete picture of several injuries that lead to a suicide at the last consequence. I mean, you showed some examples, but the question is how policymakers, if they take it serious, or how to give evidence that policy takes this serious.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I suppose two things come to mind in thinking about that. The slow ways that those harms play out and the way that we might start to see people's deaths, years after or months after a particular policy change, makes it incredibly difficult to hold the government to account, because that kind of violence has a much longer temporality. It's extended over time. And it also means that it's not produced as a sort of spectacle in the headlines in the same way, because those brutalities are slow. And I think that's how mental health is often weaponized by the government in relation to suicide, say, linked to the welfare system, because then the government can say, but suicide is complex, there's never a single cause, which I think is probably true, but they can use that and then say, and also, suicide is linked to mental health, to deny the role that they've played in producing the conditions that made somebody suicidal. But just to add, I also think this demand for evidence can be really violent. And I mean, with racism, this is that's the prime example. This constant demand to produce evidence about the harms of something that we know is harmful, and that people who live the experience of it have told us this for centuries. And yet there's this constant demand for evidence, and the evidence doesn't meet the criteria that's been set by by those in power, by that system. And so I think that can be harmful also, and a distraction, constantly having to produce the evidence rather than actually making the transformation in the system.
But I totally agree with you. But what can be done to it that the situation can get more visible, or, as I said, more taken serious by politicians? I mean, yeah. Also to Wilda, this question, both of you.
I suppose this speaks to a tension that we see a lot in the work that I do, which is how do we, are we going for reform? Like, do we want to kind of change policymakers' minds and get tweaks to the system that maybe mean a bit less harm for a few, for fewer people? Or do we want something that's much more abolitionist? That completely transforms, like destroys but transforms and builds anew in that meaning of abolition. So we can, and people do come up with very specific, and this is really important work, like very specific asks which would help to inform reform. And some people and many folks that I work with see a real value in that, and they do imagine justice as coming from the state and from the government. But there are a whole load of other folks, perhaps more informed by like disability justice, that don't see justice coming from the state and from state-sanctioned systems. Yeah. So maybe multiple-pronged approaches, I suppose, in that.
But at the end, a more bottom-up approach, it sounds to me. Yeah. So if we talk about regaining agency against corporate violence, you have shared several promising ideas for shifting existing pathologizing and stigmatizing attitudes towards mental distress in society. How and where can we start to implement them? I mean, you already gave some examples, but exactly what can psychiatrized people do to shift attitudes? Wilda.
Well, I think I've talked about one of them, and I think it has to be the first one, and that is, declaring our right to be who we are, and contesting the oppression we experience in all realms of our life. I think right now, certainly in the United States, mental health. Psychiatric survivors, as we call ourselves, we really are hyper-focused on the mental health system. And what I've tried to say in my remarks is that the problem is not the mental health system. The problem is the kind of attitudes that our culture holds about mental illness. And so I think anything that we can do to influence cultural politics is what we need to be doing. And I don't think we hold any chance of improving the mental health system, or, in my preference, abolishing it, unless we change people's attitudes about who we are. And that is that we are, right? Because right now I don't think that we're seen as human. I don't think we're seen as, we have no political power, no political influence. And I think that's where our work is.
I think we need to go further to one other topic which I wanted to talk about with you. It's a nexus between state violence, racism, and marginalized populations. So could you maybe tell us more about the nexus of state violence and marginalized populations with mental health conditions? I mean, racist police violence, there are also less visible forms of state violence which take place through cultural and state institutions. You already mentioned China, like job centers or health insurance companies. So I already heard that yeah, people labeled as mad are targeted, especially by these institutions, and especially people with intersectional discrimination experiences. What do we know about their situation in this system, social system and health system?
I think Colin did a good job yesterday of talking about the experience of non-white people in the mental health system. And I'm from the United States, and race, that's all we talk about is race, it seems. But the short answer, it's always worse if you're a member of a marginalized community. So I think in the United States, there's evidence, since they're always looking for evidence, that black people are disproportionately diagnosed with things like schizophrenia, to the point where it's really considered a kind of a black disease. Black people are disproportionately civilly committed, or they're disproportionately, put on these, they call them kind of community treatment, like where you're forced to adhere to some treatment within the community. So, I mean, the short answer is, of course, it's going to be worse if you're members of a marginalized community. I think in the United States, the narrative is, non-white people, black people don't have access to health care. That's actually one, don't have access to mental health care. And I'm actually grateful for that. It's like, that's great, because I don't want that health care. And so I am not trying to increase the mental health care for black people. I think the system is extremely harmful, and the more that we stay out of it, the healthier we'll be. I think the last thing I'll say about the nexus between mental health and race is just to reiterate what Colin said. I mean, race and mental illness are synonymous, certainly in the United States. And yeah, so I think that's what I'll say.
Yeah, so thank you very much for this discussion here on the podium. I would like to include the audience more, and maybe we also have some questions on the online. Yeah, okay. So yeah, I think. Is there a question here in front, or? Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you very much for this really great panel. I wanted to bring also another point that I think has not been touched yet in this conference, and regard also the situation of the people that are old and they get the diagnosis as dementia, and often the paths from that then to get stronger diagnosis and start to have really heavy medical treatments is really, really tiny. And I speak because of my personal experience with my dad, that he got old, he started to have symptoms of dementia, and then he got the diagnosis as Alzheimer. And they started to give him antipsychotic drugs, and this really created, a slip down of all his life. After that, he got other medicine like Rivotril, that is also, a tranquilizer. But I mean, the general impression that I got on all this system is that he was somebody that never had really a background of psychosis or any so-called mental health issues, and then suddenly enter into this vicious circus of getting these drugs and then being absolutely not able to go out because he deteriorated more, and at the end he died with that. And I have to say, this was also for me really a strong inspiration to think about this conference. So I would like also to thank my dad, because we are all here. And I wanted to really ask you if you did some studies about that, about the relationship between the dementia and the use of drugs on people that then cannot say they don't want because they are in that state, or if there is also somebody in the audience that can answer to that. So, because I know it's a very specific question, but I think also shows a system of violence.
Wilda?
Yeah, I can comment generally that that's a common occurrence in the United States for elderly people who I'm apparently elderly too. I learned in the pandemic that I'm elderly. That elderly people are put in nursing homes and basically over-medicated through antipsychotics. But the cycle that you mentioned, where you kind of get prescribed a medication from a antipsychotic, which brings on other problems that you get another medication for. I mean, that's not unique to elderly people. That's what happens. I mean, that happened to me. I was told, oh, you have, seasonal affective disorder. I was given a treatment for lights, looking into these full spectrum lights. It triggered a psychotic manic episode. So then I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And then they gave me a medication that made it difficult for me to concentrate. So then they diagnosed me with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Gave me a stimulant, which triggered another psychotic manic episode. And so that's the harm of the system, and it's unfortunately not, it's unique. It's not unique. It's not based on age. It's just based on how that system works. But there is a major problem in the United States with, going back to your father, doing exactly that and causing exactly that result. So I hope that answers your question.
I would maybe add something. I totally agree with that is a problem of the system and probably also of economization of healthcare. So it's much cheaper to give a medication, I would say, and have people quiet than care for them, because it's always more expensive to have people to care for them. I would say this is really a very reductionist way to argument, but I think this is also the problem. There are more and more people who also, there are people who want to use these services, but they're not enough staff. Also, the institutions are not provided with enough staff to be able to care for everyone. And so, when in the 60s or 50s, 1960s, 50s, the benzodiazepines were introduced, this led to a calming down on psychiatric wards, and this didn't solve any problem, of course. Yeah. But are there more questions in the audience? Or on the online there's a question, but first, yeah.
I was thinking about how much maybe it is also the point of that the digitalization and the intoxication about digitalizing media, when you compared from the 80s until now, that raised more the fact that people get more isolated, or also the thing that the human brain is only capable of getting maybe some kind of info a day, but if it goes over it shuts down, and you cannot influence people thinking the way you think now and getting them into this theme to think about it, except if you have your own past and you're triggered by it, or you had to cope with it and to learn from it. So how much do you think we should maybe have a step back from this over-digitalization that solves already some problems we wouldn't have now?
I mean, I can't speak directly to that, but the use of digitalization as a form of, if you like, or a way of enacting state violence, I think is really evident.
What I wanted to say also is that through that kind of communication we had before, for example, Sentire, we don't have that anymore in the streets, we don't have that anymore in the bus, we don't have that anymore in cinemas. People are on Netflix now, so a huge part is cut off from communicating in a human way. And this is, I think, much more a problem in politics. And this is where we are today, and I think we are now on the point that something has to happen, because it doesn't go further. We cannot go higher, faster, or anywhere now.
Yeah, so as I was saying, in terms of thinking about digitalization as a kind of weapon of state violence or a tool, the welfare state in the UK is becoming increasingly digitalized. So a lot of ways of, say, applying or finding out about or trying to get a lot of the benefits or the welfare that you might be eligible for is now done through digital systems, which immediately excludes people. I mean, digital, I don't agree that it's necessarily bad. I mean, amazing forms of resistance to state violence have taken digital forms. Okay, yeah, I hear what you say. But this is a panel about state violence. I'm trying to take what you asked and actually apply it to what we're talking about. So I think and we see that digitalization as a weapon, and it does have a distancing effect, I think, in a slightly different sense, and can be used as another form for the state to deny accountability in many ways, I think. And we see that with racist forms of policing and the way that, I mean, in global mental health, there's a big sort of emphasis on the digital. So these sort of digital interventions that are very individualized and very informed by psychiatry, but have psychiatric diagnostics designed into them, but then they're enacted through the digital. And digital forms of cognitive behavioral therapy, I think this is a massive part of the way that state violence relates to mental health increasingly.
Just maybe to add, so at this time currently in Berlin also there's the biggest psychiatrist conference, the annual conference for psychiatry and psychotherapy, which I think ended today, and I was there yesterday, and I was walking around the conference halls, and there's always one hall financed by the pharmaceutical industry, and I recognize that half of the half of the stand there was by digitalization companies, which produce like digital therapeutics, and so this is a real a big issue, a problem we need to deal with. This, just as a remark to your question. But maybe are there different? Yeah, online. Okay.
So among all the compliments that you received for your speeches, I will pick 2 questions for each of you. So to Wilda, what do you think about the treatment of mentally ill people that need antipsychosis which are not guaranteed by the state in the US? And can you please comment on the economic effects of the US state system and state violence on individual US psychiatrized humans? How can we reclaim that space to speak for ourselves? And to China, if we have to start from the language that we use, what should be replaced to mental diseases, and what's, in your opinion, an appropriate linguistic approach? Thank you.
I didn't follow my question, and I'd rather answer. I'd rather answer China's question.
Me neither. Sorry.
Maybe so long. How can we reclaim the space to speak for ourselves in relation to ill people that need antipsychotic, which are not guaranteed by the state?
No, I didn't really.
I don't understand. I'm
Me
sorry.
neither.
I want to answer the question, but I don't quite understand it.
Okay. I will pick another one that they made for you. It will be easier. So can people dispute or reject diagnosis that they feel is another form of violence used against them? Personality disorder being one example. Can this be challenged?
I think you can always reject diagnoses that are being used against you. I certainly have. I mean, I've been given so many diagnoses, and I've rejected all of them. I don't know if the person is asking if they can be kind of formally challenged, like if you can kind of go to court and, and have a hearing and put on evidence and then have a decision made. The answer to that is no. But I think part of, finding your voice and power in the mental health system is actually, interrogating those diagnoses and rejecting them. I don't see what the point of them. There's really no point to a diagnosis, right? You want to just feel better, and you're willing to do whatever it takes. You'll do what it takes to feel better, and so I don't know why you necessarily need to name something. I don't find that particularly useful. I actually find it pretty unhelpful. But I know that it does give some people comfort to feel like their problems have a name. But I feel like if it doesn't work for you, by all means reject it.
Yeah, well, thank you for the questions and for the people watching online. I guess that I'll try to answer both at the same time, and it just builds on what you said, Wilda, in terms of thinking about language. And the global mental health tends to use this sort of language of mental disorder and neuropsychiatric disorder, and I, as you might imagine, don't like that. I tend to use distress, but I also know a lot of folks don't appreciate that very much either. And I think language is so important, because if we constantly just talk about mental health, I think we miss a lot of people who experience disabling forms of state violence that might distress them, or that might cause distress or psychological pain, but that don't ever identify as disabled people or as mad people or as psychiatric survivors, right? And that don't mobilize or use that language for their kinds of activism. And in the UK, in my opinion, that by focusing only on mental health or the word disability and the mobilizing that goes through disability, we quite often miss the experience of black people and people of colour who might not use that language, but do experience this kind of disabling, distressing state violence, but might have a different way of talking about it. And so I think being careful about use of language, or more expansive, allows those kinds of connections to be made across different forms of experiences and kind of joining up struggles. But I should also say that when I've done work in India and with different groups of people who have experienced the mental health system or identify as mad, or around different countries, especially in the global south, there are also, issues with user survivor or psychiatric survivor not necessarily translating that well into some of those contexts. And so in India, Bhargavi Davar and many others taught me that actually a lot of folks may experience that kind of distress or experience alternate realities, but they haven't been psychiatrized because there isn't enough, well, not enough, because I don't think there should be, but there isn't much of a kind of psychiatric infrastructure there to do that kind of psychiatrizing. So they're still distressed, but they don't necessarily identify as a psych survivor in the same kind of way. And I think we need to be careful not to miss those people, because that's likely to be the majority of people in the majority world. And just to there are some brilliant examples of activism by people who either identify as psychosocially disabled, which kind of is more of a disability identity, or identify through psychosocial diversity. So for example, there's a Latin American network of people with psychosocial diversity. There's a brilliant Transforming Communities of Inclusion, which joins together folks across a whole range of countries in Asia and the Pacific, and they use psychosocial disability, as do the Pan-African Network of People with Psychosocial Disability. And they have a very strong structural analysis about poverty and state violence and about colonialism in the way that they understand that form of diversity or psychosocial disability.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left. Thank you. Do we have? We have more questions here.
I have a question for you, Julian.
Yeah.
I was thinking that a lot of talks are about UK and the US, and I wanted to ask about what's the situation in Germany. I'm based in Germany. I've been here for more than 10 years. So I'm also aware that here there's also a lot of bias or even racism within the health system. And I wanted to ask how far is the German health system about talking about racism, bias, discrimination within itself?
Thank you for this question. It's not easy for me to answer it for the whole system. I can just talk a little bit about my experiences. So I work at Brandenburg Medical School, which is in a rural country around Berlin, Brandenburg, and we have a problem with often right-winged service users and also racistic violence. We do have that, and we also have, but we have some researchers who have started critical whiteness seminars at our hospital. That's what I know. And we also have some rules against right-wing people to wear certain symbols on their clothes, because this often happens. This is not directly answering your question to racism, but often we need to do something against right-winged patients in Brandenburg. Yeah. Yeah, next question.
Thank you. I also have a question for you, Julian. Since you're a psychiatrist, including the trademark clipboard.
Sorry, I didn't get it. The what?
Das Klemmbrett. The clipboard. Anyways, I was asking myself, like you sitting in this panel, moderating it, that's an interesting combination, I think. And do you consider yourself to be an agent of state violence?
Question. I would say as a part yes, and as a part no. So personally, I don't want to be an agent of state violence. Of course, I want to be an ally with service users of the hospital, of the outpatient unit where I work. But on the other side, of course, I'm part of the system and I'm reproducing it. So just as you said before, there are 7 minutes. Sometimes I have 7.5 minutes contacts for outpatients, and we cannot really do something meaningful in this time. And we need to go on prescribing medication. Of course, I'm trying to reduce medication and try to bring this topic up as often I can. But there are a lot of system problems, of course, and yeah, the only possibility, and this is maybe something what I've learned today, also because your initiatives like Healing Justice London and your Marriage Freedom Advocacy Organization, that we need more bottom-up approaches. We cannot fix the system from inside. So.
I think you also brought up the question what psychiatrist people can do to change the system. So what could you, as a mental health professional, do to change the system? I know you just said you can't change it from within, but maybe you can also advocate here, like as someone in a position of power within this discourse.
Yeah, but I'm really a little bit unsure about it, as already we discussed before. So if we talk the German hospital organization and the health insurance funds, they meet annually. They decide what psychiatric performance get paid, what gets not paid, and these discussions, they don't move forward. And so I don't think it's a powerful position even from inside of the system. Maybe a leading person of those societies I just named, but can change something. But I'm not in this way, not by this way. Okay, I think the time is up. Thank you. I'm sorry. Sorry? One last question? Okay, one very last short question. I'm really not sure who's...
Well, thank you for the last question. What I found curious with Wilda's story in the beginning was that the lawyer's wife had a burnout and she was not phrased as mentally ill, which is kind of ironic to the story of it as well. So I wonder who is allowed to take that word, burnout, because it kind of is, it is reflecting the systemic violence that she probably perceived as a social worker and she got, and who is not. And so maybe you could talk a little bit more about class here. Like, is that an influencing factor, or what else could allow us to call us burnt out and not mentally ill?
I think your question is the comment. I mean, that's a very astute observation. It's something I thought as well, that this person if the person had the label mentally ill, that comment would have qualified the person for involuntary treatment. But because the person, was married to a lawyer, white, educated, insulated by, wealth and class, they get to be burned out and say whatever they want. So I thank you for that observation, masked as a question.
Okay, yeah. Thanks a lot. I just want to add a little bit, a short comment to your question about racism. I think I didn't really answer it good, because I said that we had to deal with right-wing patients only. And I want to say that, of course, we also have staff issues, and we also have staff who makes racistic comments, especially in these rural regions of around Berlin in these hospitals. It's a big issue. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wilda, and thank you, China.
So once again, I'll just ask you for a moment to stay on stage, and then we will all leave. So once again, I would like to thank, I'll start from here, China, Wilda, and Julian as well, for moderating this also, again, like a really dense panel. Another topic that we will need one more conference to maybe open up. But really, thanks so much. And I would just like to remind the audience now, we will have a break of around 30 minutes. And we are back at 7:15 for the screening of the documentary Faces of an Exhibition, and then we will continue with the last panel of the day. So see you in a couple of minutes.